The dust rose in angry spirals around Genevieve Olson's worn boots as she stumbled backward. The bucket of water she had been carrying clattering to the ground and soaking into the parched earth of Columbia, California. The year was 1867, and the gold rush town still buzzed with fortune seekers and those who fed off their desperation. Genevieve had become one of the latter, though not by choice. The laughter that followed her fall cut deeper than any physical wound could. "Look at her," Margaret Hastings said, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she stood on the wooden sidewalk outside the general store. Her pristine emerald dress a stark contrast to Genevieve's faded calico. "Can barely manage a simple task. No wonder her husband left her destitute." The words hit Genevieve like stones. Her husband had not left her. He had died in a mining accident 6 months prior. But the truth seemed to matter little to the gossips of Columbia. What mattered was that she was now a widow with no family, no fortune, and no prospects. She had taken work wherever she could find it, scrubbing floors, hauling water, mending clothes until her fingers bled. Still, it was never enough to earn respect in a town where money spoke louder than character. Perhaps, if she had been a better wife, God would not have seen fit to take poor Nathaniel from her. Mrs. Hastings continued, and the other women clustered around her nodded in agreement, their faces twisted in sanctimonious judgment. Genevieve pushed herself to her feet, her hands scraped and stinging. She was 24 years old, but some days she felt ancient. Her honey-colored hair had come loose from its bun, hanging in tangled waves around her face, and her dress bore the stains of 100 different jobs. She reached for the bucket, determined to refill it and complete her task despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "Do not bother trying again," Mr. Henderson called from the doorway of his mercantile. "I have changed my mind. I do not need help from someone so careless. You will not be paid." Genevieve's heart sank. She had been counting on those 50 cents to buy bread. "But sir, I have already scrubbed your entire storefront. I only needed to rinse it. And you failed at that simple task. Be gone before you cause more trouble." The women laughed again, their sounds like crows circling a dying animal. Genevieve bent to retrieve her threadbare shawl, trying to maintain what little dignity she had left. As she straightened, preparing to walk away with her head held as high as pride would allow, a shadow fell across the group. The man who stepped into the circle of onlookers was unlike anyone Genevieve had seen in Columbia before. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the afternoon sun. His hair fell to his shoulders in dark waves, and his face bore the weathered tan of someone who lived under open skies. He wore buckskin pants and a simple cotton shirt that strained across a chest built from years of hard labor in the mountains. His arms, visible where he had rolled up his sleeves, were corded with muscle that spoke of splitting logs, hauling furs, and surviving in the wilderness. This was a man who needed no one, who carved his existence from the unforgiving Sierra Nevada with his bare hands. "Seems to me," the mountain man said, his voice deep and steady as a river, "that a bucket fell. Nothing more." Mrs. Hastings drew herself up, clearly preparing to dismiss this newcomer. But something in his eyes made her falter. They were the color of storm clouds, gray and penetrating, and they held a quiet authority that commanded attention. "This is none of your concern, sir. This woman is known for her clumsiness and general incompetence. We were merely discussing her shortcomings." The mountain man turned his full attention to Genevieve then, and she felt the weight of his gaze sweep over her. But there was no judgment in his eyes, no scorn. Instead, she saw something that made her breath catch, a flicker of recognition, as if he understood exactly what it meant to be cast aside by people who measured worth in gold dust and social standing. "What is your name?" he asked her directly, ignoring the gasps from the women at his audacity in addressing her so familiarly. "Genevieve Olson," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Miss Olson," he said, and then paused. "Or is it Mrs.?" "Mrs.," she replied quietly. "I am a widow." He nodded once, as if this explained everything he needed to know. Then he turned back to the cluster of women and Mr. Henderson, who had stepped fully out of his store now, his arms crossed over his barrel chest. "This woman," the mountain man said, his voice carrying across the street, causing others to stop and watch, "has done nothing to deserve your scorn. She lost her husband, and now she works harder than most men I know just to survive. That takes strength." "How dare you?" Mrs. Hastings sputtered. "We are upstanding members of this community. We attend church every Sunday. This woman is clearly being punished for some moral failing." "Is that so?" The mountain man's expression did not change, but something dangerous crept into his tone. "Seems to me that the only moral failing I see here is a bunch of well-fed people mocking someone who is hungry." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. The unmistakable clink of coins filled the sudden silence. He counted out 5 silver dollars and held them out to Genevieve. "No," she said immediately, her pride rebelling against charity despite her desperate circumstances. "I cannot accept that. I have done nothing to earn it." "You have survived," he said simply. "That is enough." "I do not take handouts," Genevieve insisted, even as her stomach growled traitorously. The mountain man studied her for a long moment, then nodded with what might have been approval. "Fair enough. I have a cabin about 5 miles north of here, up in the foothills. The place is a disaster. I've been living like a bachelor too long, and it shows. I need someone to help me put it in order, do some cooking and cleaning for a few weeks, while I cure my latest batch of furs. Room and board included, plus these $5 a week." Genevieve stared at him. $5 a week was more than she made in a month of scrounging odd jobs in Colombia. It was also highly irregular for a single woman to go stay at a bachelor's cabin. The scandal would be enormous. "That is completely inappropriate," Mrs. Hastings declared, as if reading Genevieve's thoughts. "No decent woman would agree to such an arrangement. It would be scandalous." "What exactly do you think she would be scandalizing?" the mountain man asked, his tone mild but his eyes sharp. "Her sterling reputation, the one you have all been working so hard to destroy?" The truth of his words hung in the air. Genevieve's reputation was already in tatters. She had nothing left to lose except her life, which was exactly what she would lose if she could not earn enough to eat and keep a roof over her head. Winter was coming, and her current situation was unsustainable. "I will need to bring my belongings," she said, making her decision. The mountain man's face remained impassive, but she thought she detected a slight softening around his eyes. "I will wait," he said, as Genevieve hurried toward the boarding house where she rented a corner of a room for 10 cents a night. She heard the explosion of scandalized whispers behind her. Let them talk. They would talk anyway. At least this way she would have a full stomach while they did. Her belongings fit into a single canvas bag. 2 dresses, a nightgown, a hairbrush, a photograph of her and Nathaniel on their wedding day, and a small Bible that had been her mother's. Everything she owned in the world could be carried in one hand. The thought should have been depressing, but instead, as she walked back toward where the mountain man waited with a large dappled horse, she felt something strange flutter in her chest. Hope, perhaps, or simply the relief of knowing she would eat tonight. He took her bag and secured it to his saddle with practiced efficiency, then held out his hand to help her mount. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip strong but careful. He swung up behind her with an easy grace that belied his size, and Genevieve found herself acutely aware of the solid presence at her back, the arms that reached around her to take the reins. "I am Tobias McCain," he said as they began to ride north out of Columbia. "Most folks just call me Tobias." "Thank you, Mr. McCain," Genevieve said softly, "for what you did back there." "No thanks needed. I have never had much patience for bullies." They rode in silence for a while, leaving the bustling town behind. The road climbed gradually into the foothills, where pine trees began to outnumber the scrub oak, and the air grew cooler and cleaner. Genevieve had not been out of Columbia since Nathaniel's death, and she had forgotten how beautiful the Sierra Nevada foothills could be. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees in golden shafts, and somewhere nearby, she could hear the musical rush of a creek. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked, partly out of curiosity and partly to break the comfortable but somewhat awkward silence. "About 8 years now," Tobias replied. "I came west after the war, fought for the Union, saw things that made me want to be far away from people for a while, found these mountains, and decided to stay." Genevieve did the math quickly. If he had fought in the war, he must be at least in his late 20s or early 30s. She tried to imagine what he had seen, what battles he had survived, but her mind could not quite grasp it. Nathaniel had been too young to fight, only 17 when the war ended, and he had rarely spoken of it except to express relief that it was over. "Do you ever get lonely?" she asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. "Forgive me, that was presumptuous." "It is a fair question," Tobias said, and she could hear a smile in his voice. "I suppose I do sometimes. But there is a difference between being alone and being lonely. I have found that I prefer the company of mountains and rivers to most people. Present company excepted, of course." The addition of that last phrase, spoken with gentle humor, made Genevieve relax slightly. She realized she had been holding herself rigid, afraid of giving offense or doing something wrong. But Tobias did not seem like the kind of man who was easily offended, or who expected her to walk on eggshells around him. As they rode higher, the trees grew thicker, and the air took on the crisp bite of elevation. Genevieve caught glimpses of wildlife. A deer bounding through the underbrush, a hawk circling overhead, the flash of a rabbit's white tail. This was Tobias's world, she realized. This wild, beautiful place, where strength and self-reliance mattered more than social graces or family connections. The cabin appeared suddenly, nestled in a clearing beside a tumbling creek. It was larger than Genevieve had expected, built from sturdy logs, with a stone chimney and a covered porch that ran the length of the front. The setting sun painted everything in shades of amber and gold. And despite the obvious signs of bachelor neglect, the garden overrun with weeds, clothes hanging haphazardly from a line, tools scattered near a chopping block, there was something undeniably appealing about the place. "I warned you it was a disaster," Tobias said as he dismounted and then helped her down. His hands spanned her waist easily, and he lifted her as if she weighed nothing at all. For a moment, her hands rested on his shoulders, and she felt the solid muscle beneath his shirt, the strength that allowed him to survive in this harsh environment. Then her feet touched the ground, and he released her, stepping back with a respectful distance that she appreciated. "I have seen worse," Genevieve said, which was true. The boarding house in Columbia had been infested with rats and smelled of unwashed bodies and despair. This place, for all its disorder, was clean in the way that wilderness places were clean. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke and creek water. Tobias showed her inside, pushing open a door that clearly needed its hinges oiled. The interior was dim until he lit several lanterns, revealing a single large room that served as living area, kitchen, and dining space. A ladder led to a loft where she could see a bed piled with furs. Along one wall, more furs hung in various stages of preparation, filling the air with the musky scent of deer and beaver and something else she could not identify. "That is my bed," Tobias said, gesturing to the loft. "You will sleep there. I will make up a bedroll down here." "Mr. McCain, I cannot take your bed," Genevieve protested. "This is your home." "And you are my guest," he said firmly. "Also my employee, and I will not have it said that I made a lady sleep on the floor. The matter is not open for discussion." There was a finality in his tone that made argument pointless. Genevieve looked around the cabin more carefully, taking inventory. Dishes were piled in a basin, crusted with old food. The floor needed sweeping, and the ashes in the fireplace should have been cleaned out weeks ago. The table was covered with what looked like the remains of several meals, and she spotted at least 3 coffee cups in various locations around the room. "You were not exaggerating about the bachelor lifestyle," she said dryly. For the first time, she saw Tobias truly smile. It transformed his face, softening the hard edges and revealing the man beneath the mountain exterior. "I told you I needed help." That first evening passed in a blur of activity, while Tobias tended to his horse and brought in fresh water from the creek. Genevieve began the monumental task of restoring order to the cabin. She scraped and scrubbed the dishes, swept the floor, and cleaned out the fireplace. By the time darkness had fully fallen, the main room looked almost respectable. Tobias proved to be a surprisingly good cook. He prepared a simple meal of fried venison, beans, and fresh bread that he explained came from a neighbor who lived about 3 miles east. As they ate, sitting across from each other at the now clean table, Genevieve felt some of the tension that had lived in her shoulders for months begin to ease. "This is the best meal I have had in a long time," she said honestly. The food in Colombia had been scarce and of poor quality, and she had often gone to bed hungry rather than spend her meager earnings on anything more than the cheapest bread. "Then you must have been eating terrible food," Tobias replied. "This is just basic trail cooking." "Perhaps, but it is hot and there's plenty of it. That alone makes it a feast to me." Something flickered across Tobias's face, an emotion she could not quite name. Anger, perhaps, but not directed at her. "Those people in town should be ashamed of themselves," he said quietly. "Letting a woman go hungry while they parade around in their fine clothes and judge everyone who does not meet their standards." "They believe they are righteous," Genevieve said. "They go to church, they follow the rules. In their minds, my suffering must be deserved. Otherwise, God would not allow it." "That is a convenient philosophy for people who have never suffered," Tobias observed. "I have found that folks who have actually known hardship are less quick to assume others deserve theirs." Genevieve studied him across the table. In the warm light of the lanterns, she could see the scars that marked his hands and forearms, the evidence of countless small injuries sustained while living a life of hard physical labor. There was a thin white line along his jaw that looked like it might have come from a knife, and she wondered what story lay behind it. "What is it?" he asked, catching her gaze. "I was just thinking that you are nothing like the men in Colombia," she said. "They measure everything in terms of gold and status. You seem to measure things differently." "Gold is useful," Tobias said with a shrug. "But it does not keep you warm at night or watch your back when danger comes. I learned a long time ago that the things that really matter cannot be weighed or counted. Integrity, loyalty, courage, Those are the currencies I value." It was the longest speech she had heard him make, and the conviction in his words struck something deep inside her. Nathaniel had been a good man, but he had been young and still finding his way in the world. Tobias had clearly found his way long ago and had no interest in conforming to anyone else's expectations. After dinner, Tobias insisted on cleaning up, while Genevieve unpacked her few belongings in the loft. The bed was a simple frame, piled high with furs and blankets that smelled faintly of pine and wilderness. When she lay down, exhausted from the day's events, she sank into a softness she had not experienced in months. The boarding house had offered only a thin pallet on a floor she shared with 2 other women, and she had grown accustomed to waking with aches in every joint. She thought she would lie awake for hours, her mind churning over everything that had happened. But the moment her head touched the pillow, sleep pulled her under like a warm tide. Genevieve woke to the sound of an axe splitting wood and the smell of coffee brewing. Pale dawn light filtered through the small window in the loft, and for a moment, she could not remember where she was. Then it all came back. The humiliation in Colombia, Tobias's intervention, the ride to the cabin. She sat up quickly, aware that she had slept far longer than she had intended. When she climbed down the ladder, she found the cabin already transformed. Tobias had rebuilt the fire, made coffee, and was in the process of slicing bacon. He glanced up at her approach, and she was struck again by how his presence seemed to fill the space without overwhelming it. "Good morning," he said. "I hope the axe did not wake you." "I should have been up earlier," Genevieve said, feeling a flush of embarrassment. "You are paying me to work, not to sleep until all hours." "It is barely past sunrise," Tobias replied mildly. "And you looked like you needed the rest. Breakfast will be ready in a few minutes." As Genevieve moved to help with the meal preparation, she found herself falling into an easy rhythm with Tobias. He worked with the efficient economy of someone who had long been self-sufficient. But he made space for her presence without making her feel like she was in the way. It was a courtesy she had not expected, and one she appreciated more than she could express. Over the next few days, a pattern emerged. Tobias would wake before dawn and tend to the outdoor chores, chopping wood, checking his trap lines, working on his furs. Genevieve would put the cabin in order, wash clothes, prepare meals, and begin the process of turning the bachelor dwelling into something that resembled a proper home. In the evenings, they would share dinner and talk about everything and nothing. His life in the mountains, her childhood in Illinois before she came west with Nathaniel, the changing seasons and what they meant for survival in this harsh country. Genevieve found herself looking forward to those evening conversations more than she wanted to admit. Tobias was intelligent and well-read, surprising for someone who lived so far from civilization. He had books stacked in corners, volumes on natural history, poetry, even a few novels. When she commented on this, he explained that books had been his salvation during the long winters when he might not see another human being for months at a time. "A man can only talk to himself for so long before he starts to seem crazy," he said with a slight smile. "Books provide better conversation." "And now you have me to talk to," Genevieve said. "I hope I proved more interesting than your books." "You do," Tobias said, and the sincerity in his voice made her heart skip in a way that both thrilled and frightened her. She tried to tell herself that what she felt was simply gratitude. Tobias had saved her from starvation and given her a safe place to stay. It was natural that she would feel warmly toward him. But as the days turned into a week and then 2 weeks, Genevieve had to admit that her feelings ran deeper than gratitude. She found herself noticing small things about him. The way his hair fell across his forehead when he bent over his work, the rare smile that transformed his usually serious face, the gentleness with which he handled even the smallest creatures, taking care not to harm field mice when he swept them from the cabin, speaking softly to his horse. One morning, as she was hanging laundry on the line, she heard voices approaching the cabin. Tobias emerged from where he had been working on a deer hide, his expression alert. Two men rode into the clearing, both dressed in city clothes that looked absurdly out of place in the wilderness setting. "Mr. McCain?" the older of the two called out. He was perhaps 50, with gray threading through his dark hair and an air of self-importance that immediately set Genevieve on edge. "That is me," Tobias replied, not moving from his position near the cabin. Genevieve noticed that he had positioned himself between her and the strangers, a subtle but unmistakable protective gesture. "My name is Charles Pemberton. I own the lumber mill in Columbia. This is my associate, Mr. Fletcher. We have a business proposition for you." "I am listening," Tobias said, his tone neutral. Pemberton dismounted, assuming an invitation that had not been extended. "I understand you know these mountains better than anyone. I want to expand my operations into the higher elevations, but my men keep getting lost or injured. I need a guide, someone who can lead my crews to the best timber and keep them safe while they work. I am prepared to pay handsomely." "How handsomely?" Tobias asked. Pemberton named a figure that made Genevieve's breath catch. It was more money than most men in Columbia saw in a year. But Tobias's expression did not change. "That is a lot of money," he said, "which tells me this is a lot more dangerous than you are making it sound." "The mountains always carry some danger," Pemberton said smoothly. "But for a man of your experience, it should be manageable." "And how long would this work last?" "The entire winter season. We need to get the timber cut and down to the mill before the spring thaw. I would need you to commit to at least 4 months, possibly 6. Tobias was silent for a long moment, and Genevieve found herself holding her breath. 4 months in the high mountains during winter would be brutal, dangerous work. Men died in avalanches, froze to death, or simply disappeared into the white wilderness. But the money Pemberton was offering could set Tobias up for years. He would be a fool to refuse. "No," Tobias said finally. Pemberton blinked, clearly not having expected rejection. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no. I am not interested in your proposition, Mr. Pemberton." "Perhaps you did not hear the amount I mentioned. That is more money than you would make in years of trapping and selling furs." "I heard you just fine," Tobias replied. "The answer is still no." Fletcher, who had remained on his horse, spoke up for the first time. "Is it because of her?" He jerked his chin toward Genevieve, his expression dismissive. "The widow woman? I heard you took in that piece of trash from town. Surely you are not letting sentiment cloud your business judgment." The temperature in the clearing seemed to drop 10 degrees. Tobias took a single step forward, and both Pemberton and Fletcher instinctively moved back. Genevieve had seen Tobias's physical strength demonstrated in countless small ways over the past 2 weeks. But she had never seen him look dangerous until this moment. Every line of his body radiated controlled violence, and his eyes had gone flat and cold as winter ice. "You will apologize to Mrs. Olson," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Right now." Fletcher's face flushed red. "I will do no such thing. Everyone in Columbia knows what she is, a desperate woman willing to shack up with any man who will have her." Tobias moved so fast that Genevieve barely saw him cross the distance between himself and Fletcher's horse. One moment he was standing near the cabin. The next he had Fletcher by the collar and was dragging him from the saddle. Fletcher hit the ground hard, the air rushing from his lungs in a pained gasp. "Get up," Tobias said. "Get up so I can knock you down again." "Tobias, please," Genevieve said, finding her voice. "He's not worth it." Tobias looked at her, and she saw the struggle on his face. Finally, he released Fletcher and stepped back. "Get off my property, both of you, and spread the word in Columbia that if I hear anyone else speak about Mrs. Olson with anything less than respect, they will answer to me personally." Pemberton helped Fletcher to his feet, both men moving with hasty, undignified scrambles. "You are making a mistake, McCain," Pemberton said as he mounted his horse. "That is a lot of money to turn down for someone like her." "That is where you are wrong," Tobias said. "There is no amount of money worth leaving her alone and unprotected. Now leave before I forget myself and hurt one of you." The two men rode off quickly, and silence fell over the clearing. Genevieve stood frozen by the laundry line, her hands still clutching one of Tobias's shirts. Her heart was pounding, and she felt a confusing swirl of emotions. Shame that she had been insulted, gratitude that Tobias had defended her, and something deeper, warmer, at his declaration that no amount of money could make him leave her. "I am sorry," she said as Tobias walked back toward her. "I have cost you a fortune." "You have cost me nothing," he said firmly. "Those men were offering money in exchange for my integrity. That is not a trade I am willing to make. But winter is coming. You need to work, to prepare." "I have everything I need right here," Tobias said. And the way he looked at her when he said it made Genevieve's breath catch. "I do not need Pemberton's money, and I certainly do not need to spend 6 months away from—" He stopped, seeming to catch himself. "Away from my home." He had been about to say something else. Genevieve was certain of it. Away from her, perhaps? The thought made her pulse race. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Genevieve felt the need to address what had happened. "You said I have everything I need right here," she began carefully. "But in a few weeks, my time here will be up. You hired me for a month of work, and that month is almost over." Tobias had been whittling a piece of wood, but he set it aside at her words. "I have been meaning to talk to you about that. What are your plans? Will you return to Columbia?" The thought of going back to that town, to the scorn and judgment and constant struggle to survive, filled Genevieve with dread. But what other option did she have? "I suppose I will have to, unless I can find work elsewhere." "What if you stayed here?" Tobias said abruptly. "Permanently, I mean, not as hired help, but as—" He stopped, seeming to struggle for words, which was unusual for him. "As my wife." The world seemed to tilt beneath Genevieve's feet. "What?" Tobias stood and began to pace, his movements restless. "I know this is sudden. I know you have only been here a few weeks. But I have not stopped thinking about this, about you since the day I saw those vultures circling you in Columbia. You deserve better than what life has dealt you, Genevieve. You deserve to be cherished and protected and treated with the respect you are owed. I can provide that. I have this land, the cabin, a steady income from my furs. It is not a grand life, but it is honest and free. No one would look down on you here. No one would dare." Genevieve's mind reeled. "Tobias, I do not know what to say." "Say yes," he said simply. "Or if you cannot say yes, then at least do not say no. Not yet. Stay here through the winter. See what life could be like without the weight of other people's judgment pressing down on you every day. And if, come spring, you decide you want something different, I will take you anywhere you want to go. I will give you enough money to start fresh wherever you choose. But give this a chance. Give us a chance." "Us," Genevieve repeated softly. "Tobias, I am very grateful for everything you have done for me. But gratitude is not the same as love. I cannot marry you out of obligation." "I am not asking you to," he said. And now he moved closer, kneeling before her chair so that they were eye to eye. "I am asking you to give yourself the opportunity to see if gratitude might grow into something more. Because I have to tell you, Genevieve, what I feel for you is already more than simple kindness. I see your strength, your resilience, the way you refuse to be broken by people who should know better. I see how you have made this rough cabin feel like a home in just 2 weeks. I see the intelligence in your eyes and the gentleness in your hands when you mend my clothes or tend the garden. I see you, truly see you, and what I see takes my breath away." Tears stung Genevieve's eyes. No one had spoken to her like this since Nathaniel died. No, if she was being honest with herself, no one had ever spoken to her quite like this. Nathaniel had loved her in his way. But they had married young, and their affection had been the sweet, uncomplicated fondness of childhood friends. What Tobias was describing was something deeper, more intentional, the choice of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he wanted. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "I lost Nathaniel so suddenly. One day he was alive, and we were making plans, and the next day he was gone. I do not know if I can survive that kind of loss again." "Life has no guarantees," Tobias said gently. "I could die tomorrow, or I could live for 50 more years. You could decide you hate mountain life and leave next month. But I have learned that fear is not a good reason to avoid living. I was afraid after the war, afraid of what I had become and what I was capable of. I hid in these mountains, telling myself I was choosing solitude when really I was choosing cowardice. But then I saw you, and something woke up inside me. Something I thought had died on the battlefields back east. You made me want to be brave again, Genevieve. Will you be brave with me?" She looked into his storm-gray eyes and saw nothing but honesty and hope. This man, this strong, capable, infuriating man who had walked into her life and turned it upside down, was offering her everything she had thought was lost forever. A home, protection, respect, and possibly, just possibly, love. "Ask me again in the spring," she said finally. "I will stay through the winter. I will give us the chance you are asking for. But I need time, Tobias. I need to be sure that what I feel is real and not just desperation dressed up as affection." "That is fair," he said, though she could see the disappointment in his face. "I can wait. I have waited my whole life to find someone like you. A few more months will not kill me." He stood and offered her his hand to help her rise from the chair. When their palms touched, Genevieve felt that same electric awareness she had felt the day they met. The sense that something significant was happening. Something that would change the course of her life forever. The days grew shorter and colder as autumn settled over the Sierra Nevada foothills. Genevieve found herself falling into the rhythms of mountain life more easily than she would have thought possible. She learned to recognize the signs of changing weather, the way the wind shifted before a storm, the particular quality of light that meant snow was coming. Tobias taught her to fish in the creek, to identify edible plants, to read the tracks that animals left in the soft earth. They fell into an easy domesticity that felt both natural and strange. Genevieve would wake early to prepare breakfast, while Tobias tended to outdoor chores. They would eat together, talking about their plans for the day. Then Tobias would head out to check his trap lines, or work on preparations for winter, while Genevieve managed the household tasks. In the evenings, they would cook dinner together, and afterward, they would sit by the fire, reading or talking, until exhaustion sent them to their separate beds. It was a simple life, but Genevieve found more contentment in it than she had known in years. There was something deeply satisfying about work that produced visible, tangible results. She could look around the cabin and see the fruits of her labor. Shelves lined with preserves she had made from wild berries, herbs drying from the rafters, a mended quilt that now adorned the bed in the loft. She was building something, creating a life with her own hands, and no one was there to mock her or find her wanting. But more than the work, it was Tobias's presence that made each day feel like a gift. He treated her with a consistent kindness and respect that she had not known was possible between a man and a woman. He never tried to assert authority over her, never made her feel small or foolish, never raised his voice in anger. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions, asking her advice on everything from how to arrange the furniture to whether they should plant a larger garden in the spring. One cold afternoon in late October, Genevieve was outside gathering the last of the herbs from the garden when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Her first instinct was alarm, remembering Pemberton and Fletcher, but Tobias emerged from the cabin with a smile on his face. "It is all right," he called to her. "That will be Samuel and Martha Crane. They are my nearest neighbors." The couple who rode into the clearing were both in their 50s, weather-worn but friendly-looking. Martha was a small woman with sharp eyes and a warm smile, while Samuel was tall and rangy, built like someone who had spent his life working the land. "Tobias McCain," Martha said as she dismounted. "We heard rumors that you had taken in a woman, and I had to come see for myself if you had finally given up your hermit ways." "Hello, Martha," Tobias said, and Genevieve could hear the affection in his voice. "This is Genevieve Olson. Genevieve, these are the Cranes. They are the closest thing I have to family out here." "Mrs. Olson?" Samuel said, tipping his hat. "It is a pleasure." Martha, however, wasted no time on formalities. She walked straight up to Genevieve and took her hands, studying her face with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow was not. "I have heard stories from Columbia," she said bluntly, "about how the good people of that town treated you. I want you to know that not everyone out here shares their small-minded cruelty. You are welcome in these mountains, and anyone who says otherwise will answer to me." The fierce protectiveness in Martha's voice made Genevieve's eyes sting with tears. "Thank you," she managed. "That means more than you know." "Now then," Martha said briskly, releasing Genevieve's hands. "I brought some of my apple preserves and a few other supplies I thought you might need. Winter comes on fast up here, and it is always easier with a well-stocked pantry." They spent the rest of the afternoon in pleasant company. Martha proved to be a wealth of information about surviving mountain winters, and she shared advice on everything from treating frostbite to keeping the cabin warm during blizzards. Samuel and Tobias fell into easy conversation about hunting and timber and the state of the trails leading down to Columbia. As the Cranes were preparing to leave, Martha pulled Genevieve aside. "That man looks at you like you hung the moon," she said quietly. "I have known Tobias for 6 years, and I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Whatever those fools in Columbia said about you, pay them no mind. You are exactly where you are meant to be." After the Cranes left, Genevieve found herself thinking about Martha's words. Did Tobias really look at her that way? She had noticed the attention he paid her, the way his gaze would follow her movements. But she had attributed it to simple attraction. Could it truly be something deeper? That night, as they prepared for bed, Genevieve made a decision. "Tobias," she said, as he was laying out his bedroll by the fire, "I want to thank you again for everything you have done for me. These past weeks have been the happiest I have known in a very long time." He looked up at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "You do not need to thank me, Genevieve. Having you here has been a gift. I want you to know that I am starting to understand what you meant when you asked me to stay, about giving us a chance. I am still afraid, but I am also starting to hope, and I have not allowed myself to hope for anything in a very long time." Something fierce and bright sparked in Tobias's eyes. He stood, crossing the space between them with 2 long strides. For a moment, she thought he might embrace her. But instead, he simply took her hand and raised it to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Hope is good," he said softly. "Hope keeps us alive when nothing else can. Hold on to that, Genevieve. Hold on to it and let it grow." The first snow came in early November, a light dusting that transformed the world into something magical and strange. Genevieve woke to find the clearing covered in white, and she could not suppress a delighted laugh. Tobias, who was already up and stoking the fire, smiled at her reaction. "This is nothing," he said. "Wait until we get a real storm, then you will see snow." He was right. A week later, the sky turned iron gray, and the wind began to howl. Snow fell so thickly that Genevieve could barely see the tree line from the cabin windows. It fell for 2 days straight, piling up until the drifts reached halfway up the door. Tobias had to dig them out just so they could access the woodpile and the shed where he kept supplies. Being snowbound with Tobias was both exciting and terrifying. The cabin felt smaller somehow, more intimate. They were forced into close proximity, their separate sleeping arrangements the only thing maintaining propriety. Genevieve found herself hyper-aware of every casual touch, every accidental brush of hands, every moment when their eyes met and held. On the second night of the storm, as the wind screamed outside and the fire crackled cheerfully within, Tobias pulled out a battered fiddle that Genevieve had not known he owned. He played surprisingly well, filling the cabin with melodies that ranged from mournful to joyful. Without thinking, Genevieve began to sing along to a song she remembered from childhood, and Tobias's face lit up with pleasure. They spent hours that night making music together, and when they finally stopped, exhausted and laughing, Genevieve realized that she could not remember the last time she had felt so completely, unreservedly happy. "Where did you learn to play like that?" she asked, as Tobias carefully put the fiddle away. "My mother taught me," he said. "She died when I was 12, but she made sure I knew how to make music before she went. She said that a man with music in his soul would never be truly alone." "She sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was," Tobias agreed. "She would have liked you. You have the same kind of quiet strength she had, the ability to find joy even in difficult circumstances." The comparison touched Genevieve deeply. To be compared to someone Tobias had clearly loved so much felt like an honor. "I wish I could have met her." "So do I," Tobias said softly. Then, almost hesitantly, he added, "She used to tell me that I would know the right woman when I met her because she would feel like coming home. I never understood what she meant until I saw you in Colombia that day. You felt like coming home, Genevieve, even though we were strangers." Genevieve's heart hammered in her chest. They were straying into dangerous territory, speaking of feelings that should perhaps remain unspoken until she had made her decision. But she could not seem to stop herself from asking, "And do I still feel that way? Now that you know me better?" "More so every day," Tobias said, and the raw honesty in his voice made her breath catch. "I wake up, and the first thing I think about is whether you slept well. I go about my work, and I find myself hurrying to finish so I can get back to the cabin and see your face. I have never been a man who needed anyone, Genevieve. I have always been self-sufficient, content in my solitude. But you have changed something fundamental in me. Now I cannot imagine going back to the way things were before. Even if you decide in the spring that you want to leave, I will never regret asking you to stay." Genevieve felt tears prick her eyes. "Tobias, I need to tell you something. I have been lying to myself, trying to be cautious and sensible, because I was afraid of being hurt again. But the truth is that I stopped thinking of this as a temporary arrangement weeks ago. Somewhere between learning to fish and preserving berries and sitting by the fire, listening to you read, I fell in love with you. I do not need until spring to know that I want to stay. I want to marry you, Tobias McCain, if the offer still stands." For a moment, Tobias simply stared at her, as if he could not quite believe what he had heard. Then, with a sound that was half laugh and half sob, he crossed the space between them and pulled her into his arms. Genevieve went willingly, wrapping her arms around his broad back and pressing her face against his chest. She could feel the rapid beating of his heart, the warmth of his body, the strength in the arms that held her as if she were something precious and fragile. "The offer stands," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It will always stand, Genevieve. For as long as I draw breath, I am yours if you will have me." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, and what she saw in his face took her breath away. This man, this strong, proud, independent man, was looking at her with such open adoration that she felt humbled by it. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was nothing like the hurried, fumbling kisses of her youth with Nathaniel. This was a kiss from a man who knew exactly what he was doing, who took his time to savor every moment. His lips were gentle but firm, asking rather than demanding, and when Genevieve responded, opening to him, she felt a warmth spread through her entire body. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Tobias rested his forehead against hers. "I will make you happy," he promised. "I will spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of you." "You already are worthy," Genevieve whispered. "You saved me, Tobias, in every way a person can be saved. You gave me hope and safety and the freedom to be myself. How could I not love you for that?" They spent the rest of the night talking, making plans, and stealing kisses like teenagers drunk on first love. Tobias wanted to ride to Columbia as soon as the storm passed to find a preacher. But Genevieve convinced him to wait until the spring. It would give them time to prepare properly, and besides, she was in no hurry to return to Columbia and face the judgment of its residents. "Let them think what they want," she said. "I know the truth. We know the truth. That is all that matters." The winter passed in a blur of contentment. Tobias taught Genevieve how to snowshoe, and they took long walks through the winter wonderland, marveling at the beauty of the ice-covered trees and the perfect silence that only deep snow could create. They read together by the fire, discussed everything from philosophy to practical matters of homesteading, and learned the rhythms of each other's bodies and hearts. True to his word, Tobias continued to sleep in his bedroll by the fire, maintaining propriety despite the fact that they were now engaged. Genevieve appreciated his respect for her reputation. even if that reputation was already ruined in the eyes of Columbia's residents. It spoke to his character, his commitment to doing things properly. The Cranes visited twice more before the deep snows made travel impossible. And each time, Martha's approval of their engagement was evident. She had taken Genevieve under her wing, treating her like the daughter she had never had. And the older woman's acceptance meant more to Genevieve than she could express. In early March, as the snow began to melt and the first signs of spring appeared, Tobias announced that it was time to make the trip to Columbia. "I want you to be my wife in truth," he said. "I want it official and legal so that no one can ever question your place here or your rights as Mrs. McCain." Genevieve understood his reasoning, but she could not suppress the anxiety that filled her at the thought of returning to Columbia. What would people say? How would they react? Would the preacher even agree to marry them, given the scandal of their living arrangement? "They do not matter," Tobias reminded her, as if reading her thoughts. "Their opinions have no power over us unless we give them that power. We are going to Columbia to fulfill a legal requirement, nothing more. If they want to gossip and judge, let them. We will return to our mountain and live our lives in peace." His confidence bolstered her courage. They packed supplies and made the journey down to Columbia on a bright morning when the air smelled of pine and wet earth. The town looked the same as Genevieve remembered, but she felt like a completely different person from the desperate, broken woman who had left 6 months earlier. She sat tall on Tobias's horse, her back straight and her head high, no longer afraid of what people might think. Their arrival caused an immediate stir. Genevieve could see curtains twitching in windows, could hear the whispers as people recognized her. But with Tobias at her side, she found that the whispers did not sting as they once had. Let them talk. She knew the truth of her own worth now. They went first to the church, where Reverend Thompson presided. The Reverend was a middle-aged man with kind eyes, and he listened carefully as Tobias explained their situation. "You wish to be married," the Reverend said when Tobias finished. "That is commendable. However, I must ask, have the two of you been living together without the sanctity of marriage?" "We have been living under the same roof," Tobias admitted. "But I have treated Mrs. Olson with nothing but respect and propriety. She has been my housekeeper and nothing more until such time as we can be properly wed." The Reverend studied them both carefully. Then, to Genevieve's surprise, he smiled. "I believe you, Mr. McCain, and even if I did not, I would still perform the ceremony. Mrs. Olson has been poorly treated by this community, and I would be honored to help rectify that wrong. When would you like the wedding to take place?" "As soon as possible," Tobias said. "Today, if you can manage it." The Reverend consulted a small book on his desk. "I have no other obligations this afternoon. If you can find 2 witnesses, I can marry you at 4 o'clock. They left the church in high spirits, but those spirits were quickly dampened when they encountered Margaret Hastings on the street. The woman who had led the chorus of scorn against Genevieve 6 months earlier looked just as imperious and judgmental as ever. Well, she said, looking Genevieve up and down with barely concealed disdain. "The prodigal returns. I see you are still clinging to your mountain man, though I notice no ring on your finger. How disappointing, though not surprising." Before Genevieve could respond, Tobias stepped forward. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "Mrs. Hastings, I am going to say this once, and I suggest you listen carefully. Genevieve and I are being married this afternoon. From this day forward, she is my wife, and she has my protection. If you or anyone else in this town speaks to her or about her with anything less than complete respect, you will answer to me. Am I being clear?" Mrs. Hastings's face flushed red. "How dare you threaten me? I am a pillar of this community." "And she is about to be my wife," Tobias countered. "Which means she is under my protection, and I take that responsibility very seriously. Now, you can choose to be civil, or you can choose to test my patience. But I warn you, Mrs. Hastings, you will not enjoy the results if you choose the latter." For a moment, Genevieve thought Mrs. Hastings might actually challenge him. But something in Tobias's stance, the sheer physical presence of him, made the woman reconsider. She sniffed disdainfully and hurried away without another word. That was perhaps not the wisest approach, Genevieve said quietly, though she could not suppress a smile. "You have likely made an enemy." "She was already an enemy," Tobias replied. "At least now she knows the consequences of acting on her hostility." They found their witnesses in the Cranes, who had ridden into town that morning for supplies and were delighted to be asked to attend the wedding. At exactly 4 o'clock, Genevieve stood before Reverend Thompson in the small church, with Tobias at her side and the Cranes as witnesses. She wore the best dress she owned, a simple blue cotton that she had mended and cleaned until it looked almost new. Tobias had trimmed his beard and hair, and he wore clean buckskins and a shirt that Genevieve had made for him over the winter. As the Reverend began the ceremony, Genevieve felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. This was where she was meant to be, standing beside this man who had saved her in every way that mattered. When it came time for the vows, Tobias took her hands in his and spoke with a conviction that left no doubt about his feelings. "I, Tobias McCain, take you, Genevieve Olson, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to cherish you, protect you, and stand by your side through whatever trials life brings us. I promise to treat you with the respect and honor you deserve every day for the rest of my life. And I promise to love you with everything I am and everything I have, from this day until my last breath." Genevieve felt tears streaming down her face as she repeated her own vows, her voice strong despite her emotion. When Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, Tobias kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart soar. They celebrated with a simple dinner at the Cranes' home, and then, as the sun began to set, Tobias and Genevieve began the journey back to their mountain. They rode in comfortable silence, Genevieve seated in front of Tobias with his arms around her, guiding the horse up the familiar trail. "How do you feel, Mrs. McCain?" Tobias asked as the cabin came into view. "Like I am exactly where I belong," Genevieve replied, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. That night, their wedding night, Tobias carried Genevieve over the threshold of their cabin, and finally, they came together as husband and wife. Tobias was gentle and patient, taking his time to ensure her comfort and pleasure. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the bed in the loft, Genevieve felt a completeness she had never known was possible. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you so much it frightens me sometimes." "Do not be frightened," Tobias murmured, pulling her closer. "I am here, and I am not going anywhere. We have forever, Genevieve. Forever to love each other and build a life together." The seasons turned, and Genevieve and Tobias settled into married life. Spring brought new growth and new possibilities. They planted a large garden, expanded the chicken coop that Tobias had built, and made plans to add a room onto the cabin. The Cranes became regular visitors, and gradually, Genevieve began to meet other mountain families who lived scattered throughout the foothills. To her surprise and delight, she found that these people, who lived far from the judgment and social constraints of Columbia, accepted her without question. She was Tobias's wife, and that was all the credentials she needed. In late summer, Genevieve realized that she had missed her monthly courses. At first, she attributed it to the hard physical work of homesteading. But as the weeks passed and other symptoms appeared, she could no longer deny the truth. She was pregnant. She chose to tell Tobias one evening after dinner, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. "Tobias," she said, reaching for his hand, "I have something to tell you. We are going to have a baby." The look of pure, unadulterated joy that spread across Tobias's face was something Genevieve would remember for the rest of her life. He stood abruptly, pulling her to her feet and spinning her around with a whoop of excitement that startled the chickens. "A baby," he kept repeating. "We are having a baby. Genevieve, you have made me the happiest man alive." "I am glad you are pleased," she said, laughing at his enthusiasm. "I confess I was a bit nervous about telling you." "Nervous? Why would you be nervous? This is wonderful news. We are going to be parents." His excitement was contagious, and Genevieve found her own joy expanding to match his. They spent the rest of the evening making plans, talking about names and discussing how they would need to expand the cabin before the baby arrived. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Martha Crane, who had delivered dozens of babies in her time, took charge of Genevieve's care, visiting regularly to check on her progress and offer advice. Tobias became almost comically protective, insisting that Genevieve rest more and take on fewer of the heavy chores. She protested that she was pregnant, not invalid, but secretly she loved the way he fussed over her. In early March, as the first signs of spring appeared once again, Genevieve went into labor. Martha arrived just after dawn, and Tobias was banished to the porch while the women went about the serious business of bringing new life into the world. The labor was long and difficult, and more than once, Tobias burst through the door, unable to stay away when he heard Genevieve cry out in pain. Each time, Martha firmly redirected him back outside, assuring him that everything was progressing normally. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith, the sharp cry of a newborn baby filled the cabin. Tobias rushed inside to find Genevieve exhausted but glowing, cradling a tiny bundle in her arms. "It is a boy," she said, her voice hoarse but filled with wonder. "Tobias, we have a son." Tobias approached slowly, almost reverently, and Genevieve pulled back the blanket to reveal their child's face. The baby had a shock of dark hair and Tobias's storm-gray eyes. And when Tobias touched one tiny hand, the infant's fingers curled around his father's much larger finger. "He is perfect," Tobias breathed. "Absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but now, looking at their son, Genevieve knew exactly what felt right. "I want to name him Nathan, after my first husband. Nathaniel gave me my start in this territory, even though our time together was brief. Without him, I would never have come west, never have ended up in Colombia, and never have met you. I think he would want our son to carry his name." Tobias was quiet for a long moment, and Genevieve worried that she had offended him. But when he looked at her, his eyes were bright, with unshed tears. "That is a generous and kind thing to offer," he said. "Nathan McCain, I think it is perfect." Little Nathan proved to be a healthy, vigorous baby with a good appetite and a strong set of lungs. Genevieve marveled at how quickly she fell into the rhythms of motherhood. And Tobias proved to be a devoted father, constantly holding and talking to his son as if the baby could understand every word. As Nathan grew, the cabin filled with the sounds of childhood. Laughter, babbling, and eventually, the patter of small feet. Tobias built toys for his son, carved animals and blocks, and taught Nathan to appreciate the wilderness that surrounded their home. Genevieve watched her husband and son together and felt a contentment so profound it sometimes brought her to tears. When Nathan was 2 years old, Genevieve discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news was less of a surprise, but no less joyful. Their second child, a daughter they named Grace, arrived in the autumn, and she proved to be as different from her brother as night from day. Where Nathan was energetic and adventurous, Grace was calm and contemplative, content to sit quietly and observe the world around her. The years passed in a blur of joy and hard work. Tobias and Genevieve expanded their homestead, adding more land and building a larger cabin to accommodate their growing family. They made annual trips to Colombia for supplies, and each time, Genevieve held her head high, secure in the knowledge of who she was and what she had built. The people of Colombia gradually changed their tune about Genevieve McCain. It was hard to maintain scorn for a woman who was clearly thriving, who had built a good life and raised healthy, happy children. Even Mrs. Hastings, who remained distant and cool, could not deny that Genevieve had proven herself to be a respectable woman. But Genevieve no longer cared what the people of Colombia thought. Her life was in the mountains, with Tobias and their children, surrounded by friends like the Cranes and the other mountain families who had become their community. She had found where she belonged, and no amount of past judgment could diminish the joy of that discovery. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Tobias surprised Genevieve with a trip to the high meadow, where he had proposed to take her on their first winter together. Though the proposal had come before, they had actually made the journey. It was summer now, and the meadow was carpeted with wildflowers in every color imaginable. They left the children, now numbering 4, including 2 more sons born in the intervening years, with Martha Crane, and rode out alone. "Do you remember what I told you that day in Colombia?" Tobias asked as they stood together in the meadow, the mountains rising majestic and eternal around them. "When I first asked you to come home with me?" "You told me many things," Genevieve replied, leaning against his solid warmth. "Which particular thing are you referring to?" "I told you that you deserved to be cherished and protected and treated with respect. I told you that I could provide those things. Do you think I have kept that promise?" Genevieve turned to look at him, this man who had saved her life in every way that mattered. His hair was now streaked with gray, and lines had appeared at the corners of his eyes. But he was still the strong, capable mountain man who had stepped into that dusty street and changed her life forever. "You have exceeded every promise you made," she said, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "You have given me more than I ever dreamed possible. You have given me love and family and a home where I am valued for who I am. You saw me at my lowest point, when I had nothing and no one. And you treated me like I was precious. You treated me like royalty in front of everyone who had scorned me. And you have continued to treat me that way every single day since. I love you, Tobias McCain, more than words could ever express." "And I love you," Tobias said, his voice rough with emotion. "You took a broken, lonely man and taught him how to live again. You gave me purpose and joy and a reason to wake up every morning with gratitude. Every day with you has been a gift, Genevieve. Every single day." They kissed there in the meadow, surrounded by wildflowers and the eternal mountains, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from the ruins of a hard world. As they rode back toward their cabin, toward their children and their life, Genevieve reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had lost so much: her first husband, her reputation, nearly her life itself. But in losing everything, she had found something infinitely more valuable. She had found herself She had found her strength, and she had found a love that would last forever. A love built on mutual respect and genuine partnership. A love that had flourished in the wild freedom of the mountains. The cabin came into view as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, smoke rising from the chimney and the sound of children's laughter drifting on the evening air. This was home. This was family. This was everything that mattered. Tobias helped Genevieve down from the horse, and together they walked toward their front door. Nathan came running to greet them, followed by Grace and the younger boys, all of them talking at once about their adventures with Aunt Martha. Tobias scooped up the youngest, while Genevieve embraced Grace, and they went inside together. A family complete and unshakable. That night, after the children were asleep and the fire had burned down to glowing embers, Genevieve and Tobias sat together on their porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The mountains stood silent and watchful around them, bearing witness to the life they had built in this wild, beautiful place. "Do you ever regret it?" Tobias asked quietly. "Leaving civilization behind? Living this hard life in the mountains?" Genevieve considered the question seriously, as she considered all of Tobias's questions. Then she shook her head. "Never. Not for a single moment. This life, this hard, beautiful, challenging life, is exactly what I was meant for. And you are exactly who I was meant to find. If I had to go through everything I endured to end up here with you, I would do it again in a heartbeat. Even the scorn, even the hunger and hardship, even that," Genevieve confirmed, "because it brought me here. It brought me to you, and that makes everything worth it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, hands intertwined, bodies pressed close together. Inside the cabin, their children slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were loved and protected. The creek burbled its eternal song nearby, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out to the night. This was the life Genevieve had never known she wanted, but now could not imagine living without. She had been scorned and dismissed by people who measured worth in shallow terms. But Tobias had seen her true value, had treated her with dignity and respect when she had nothing, and had shown her what real love looked like. Years continued to pass, each season bringing its own joys and challenges. Nathan grew into a strong young man who inherited his father's love of the mountains and his mother's gentle heart. Grace blossomed into a thoughtful, intelligent young woman who could track a deer as easily as she could recite poetry. The younger boys, Thomas and James, were mirror images of mischief and adventure, keeping their parents constantly alert and frequently amused. Genevieve and Tobias grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. The physical passion of their early days mellowed into something even more profound, a bone-deep partnership that required no words, only presence. They could communicate with a glance, work together with seamless coordination, and find comfort in simple proximity. When Genevieve's hair turned silver and Tobias's back began to stiffen from decades of hard work, they finally allowed their children to take over more of the heavy labor. Nathan built his own cabin on the far side of the property and married a sweet girl from one of the neighboring mountain families. Grace chose to stay single, declaring that she preferred her independence and her books to any man's company, a choice that both Genevieve and Tobias supported without question. On a warm spring evening, when Genevieve was 60 years old and Tobias 63, they sat together on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. Their grandchildren played in the clearing, the next generation of McCains learning to love these mountains as their parents and grandparents had. "Do you remember the day we met?" Genevieve asked, her head resting on Tobias's shoulder. "How scared I was. How certain I was that my life was over. I remember thinking you were the bravest person I had ever seen, Tobias replied. Standing there with your head up, refusing to let them break you, even though they were trying their hardest to do exactly that. You saved me that day. No, Tobias corrected gently. I gave you a chance to save yourself. You did the rest, Genevieve. You chose to be brave. You chose to trust me. You chose to build this life. That was all you. Genevieve smiled, knowing there was truth in what he said. She had made choices, every step of the way. She had chosen to accept Tobias's offer. She had chosen to stay. She had chosen to love again despite her fear of loss. And those choices had led her to this perfect moment, surrounded by family, secure in the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. I have been thinking, Tobias said suddenly, about what happens after we are gone. The children will inherit this land, but I want to make sure they understand what it means. This place, this life we built, it is more than just property. It is a testament to what is possible when people treat each other with dignity and respect, when they look beyond surface judgments and see the truth beneath. You want them to remember our story? Genevieve said, understanding immediately. I want them to remember that their mother was scorned and dismissed by people who should have known better. And I want them to remember that I chose to treat her differently. Not because I was some kind of hero, but because it was the right thing to do. Because every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. That is a good legacy, Genevieve agreed. But I think our best legacy is them. She gestured toward their grandchildren, toward Nathan and Grace and Thomas and James, all of whom were now watching the younger generation with the same mixture of love and amusement that Genevieve and Tobias felt. We raised good people, Tobias. People who understand the value of kindness and hard work and treating others with respect. That is what will endure long after we are gone. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Genevieve McCain felt a profound sense of peace. Her life had taken her from the depths of despair to heights she had never imagined possible. She had known loss and hardship, but she had also known love in its purest, most enduring form. The story of the mountain man who saw how she was treated with scorn and chose instead to treat her like royalty had become something of a legend among the mountain families. People told it to their children as an example of how one person's kindness could change the course of another's life. But for Genevieve and Tobias, it was simply their truth, the foundation upon which they had built everything that mattered. More years passed, and eventually, the inevitable came. Tobias passed away peacefully in his sleep on a cold winter night, with Genevieve holding his hand and their children gathered around. He was 72 years old and had lived a full, rich life. Genevieve mourned deeply, but she also felt grateful for every moment they had shared, every sunrise they had watched together, every challenge they had overcome side by side. She lived for 5 more years after Tobias's death, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, secure in the home they had built together. She spent her final years telling stories about their life, making sure that the next generation understood where they came from and what values had shaped their family. On a beautiful spring morning, when the meadows were carpeted with wildflowers and the creek sang its eternal song, Genevieve McCain closed her eyes for the last time. She died as she had lived the second half of her life, with dignity, surrounded by love, and secure in the knowledge that she had mattered, that she had made a difference, that she had lived a life worth living. Her children buried her beside Tobias on a hill overlooking the valley, with a view of the mountains they had both loved. The headstone was simple but eloquent. Genevieve McCain, beloved wife, mother, and friend. She turned scorn into strength and built a legacy of love. And for generations after, the McCain family told the story of the mountain man and the scorned widow, of how Tobias had seen Genevieve's true worth when no one else would, and how that single act of kindness had blossomed into a love that changed not just their lives, but the lives of everyone who came after them. The cabin still stands in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, maintained by McCain descendants who understand that it represents something more valuable than shelter. It represents the truth that every person deserves dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances. It represents the power of one person choosing kindness over cruelty, understanding over judgment. And most of all, it represents the enduring power of love to transform lives and build futures that honor the past while embracing the promise of tomorrow. The mountains remember. The creek still sings, and somewhere in the wind that whispers through the pines, you can almost hear the echo of two voices, laughing together over some shared joke, planning their next adventure, living their love story for all eternity in the wild, beautiful place they called home.